The question for this lecture is quite simple. Why is there a Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights are probably for most Americans, the most important part of the Constitution. It is probably the part of the Constitution that Americans are most familiar with. There's an historian who took a survey of his students over a decade, and he'd asked them, okay, what is important about the Constitution? And the vast majority of the students all agreed that it was that there is this Bill of Rights. And so I think it's pretty important for us to ask, why is there this Bill of Rights? And we also need to understand something a little bit about the process of how the Bill of Rights came into being. And one of the first points I'd like to make about that is that the Bill of Rights did not come out of the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. It was not the product of the Federalists, the people who supported the Constitution. It is really the product of the Anti-Federalists, the people who opposed the Constitution, the people who lost the debate. Those are the people who essentially push forward the idea of a Bill of Rights, and those are the people who, although they lose, sort of win by getting a Bill of Rights. Why would they think a Bill of Rights important? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, there's a tradition, an Anglo-American tradition, a British-American tradition, reaching back at least to the British Bill of Rights of 1688-89, which was a part of their Glorious Revolution, which protected some rights, but it also articulated sort of Parliament's right to have a more direct say in the governing process of Great Britain. When the revolutionaries in 1776 and 1777 created state governments, and we have to remember that we focus in on the US Constitution. We focus in on the Articles of Confederation. But the revolutionaries in 1776 and 1777 devoted most of their energies, most of their creative energies, to the writing of their individual state constitutions, because the states were their nations, were their country. And the revolutionaries were given this unique opportunity, and they were very conscious of it, very much aware that they were basically given a clean slate to create government from scratch. And they engaged in a variety of different kinds of government. Some had a strong executive. Some had almost an invisible executive. Some had a single house of legislature. Some had two houses of legislature, giving different powers. And they had this really complete variety, panoply of different kinds of state constitutions. And yet, many of these constitutions, 7 of these constitutions, included bills of rights. Bills of rights intended to protect the citizens against the power of government. Remember, the more power government had, the less liberty the people had. And that liberty, and liberty here meaning very much connected to the protection of property, the protection to control the fruits of one's own labor. These are the kinds of phrases that the revolutionaries used. That liberty was really what they were fighting the revolution about. So putting a Bill of Rights into their fundamental law, their state constitutions, was very, very important. So there's this tradition, Anglo-American tradition. There's this immediate experience, sort of 2 reasons for having a Bill of Rights. And a third reason would be, quite simply, to protect rights. To protect rights. Well, in the summer of 1787, it was a hot summer in Philadelphia. And the convention delegates who were there worked out and argued and debated some very intense and difficult issues throughout the entire summer. Compromises had to be made. They had to decide how many houses of legislature, what powers they would have, how long people would be elected for. They had to create an executive. They had to decide what kinds of powers this executive would have. All these things took time. They had to debate and discuss issues of slavery. And by the end of the summer, as it was moving into September, as they began to see this document come together, they were exhausted. They were, drained. And the idea of, bringing in a new issue was something they just did not want to think of. And so when George Mason, and George Mason is one of those founding fathers we don't ordinarily hear about, but George Mason was a very good friend to George Washington, just lived a couple of miles away from Mount Vernon, was considered one of the preeminent legal minds of the era. Got up and suggested, yeah, okay, we're working on this document. I like this document. Some things I like, some things I don't like. Okay, but I really think that, like in the Virginia state constitution, we ought to have a Bill of Rights. He got nowhere. Most of the rest of the delegates said, no, we really don't want to bring this in. And they came up with a whole list of reasons why they were against the idea of having a Bill of Rights. In other words, the founding fathers, the men we revere, the men we hold up as the creators of the US Constitution said, no, we don't need a Bill of Rights. So let's not connect the Bill of Rights to these founding fathers, or most of these founding fathers. Let's not connect the Bill of Rights to the winners of history, the men who wrote the Constitution. Right? This is an important concept for us to be able to understand. George Mason was distressed. He was so distressed that at the end of the convention, he refused to sign the Constitution and refused to support it because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Well, let's take a look at some of those arguments against the Bill of Rights. One of the arguments was that the states have bills of rights, so why should we have a Bill of Rights? The rights of the people are already protected in the individual states. Another argument articulated by Alexander Hamilton, especially in Federalist number 84, the Federalist Papers, this iconic set of essays that were thrown together, but which we have in our minds held up as sort of the interpretive window into the minds of the founding fathers. In Federalist number 84, Hamilton says, we don't need a Bill of Rights. We don't need a Bill of Rights because if we articulate and list some rights, the implication is that any right we don't listen can be abused. Listen to his language. I affirm that bills of rights in the same sense and in the extent in which they are contended for are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would be dangerous. Founding father saying the Bill of Rights would be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers which are not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? The Constitution doesn't threaten people's rights. We start listing rights, and then anything that's not listed is threatened. Therefore, they're dangerous. From Hamilton's perspective, right? From Hamilton's perspective, the idea that the Constitution begins, we the people, asserts the sovereignty of the people. And Hamilton was challenging what had hitherto been that essential assumption of most revolutionaries, that the power of government, right, the more power government has, the less liberty the people have, right? Hamilton was saying, well, if the power of the government is granted by the people, as the phrase, we the people, implies is the opening phrase of the Constitution of the United States. If the Constitution is derived from the people, there's no need to have a Bill of Rights because the people don't need to be protected from the people. If this sounds like double talk, it was. It was. And this came up. This came up in the debates over the ratification process. Okay, after the Philadelphia Convention that ended in September 1787, the Constitution was sent out to the states. Special state ratification conventions were called. These met, first several, Delaware, Pennsylvania, ramrodded the Constitution through. But as the debates continued over the next couple of months, there were more and more people who began to attack the Constitution. These people we refer to as the Anti-Federalists, and they attacked it on a whole variety of ways, mainly with the idea that it had created too powerful a government, which was going to usurp the liberty of the people. And if there was this too powerful a government that was going to usurp the liberty of the people, absolutely essential would be a Bill of Rights. And so the fact that the Federalists had not included a Bill of Rights turned out to be a major political blunder. It was a mistake, not just constitutionally, it was a mistake politically. And that the Federalists began to realize. Because in several states, the number of people who were elected to the state constitutional conventions in places like Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia, the three most important states of any future United States at this point. More people were elected to the state conventions who were anti-Federalists than who were Federalists. In other words, if they showed up and just simply voted right away, the Constitution would not have been ratified. So the Federalists had to do something. They had to argue for this Constitution, and they had to give ground. And where they gave ground was over the issue of a Bill of Rights. They gave ground and said, several state conventions said, we will ratify only if there's a guarantee that there will be amendments to protect rights. And of course, Federalists didn't want that. Or they said things like, we will ratify only if there's a second convention. And anybody who'd been to the first convention said, there's no way I want a second convention. Well, it was hard enough getting it done the first time. Getting it done a second time, that's just not going to be any good. So they sort of gave ground, and they promised to get a Bill of Rights. They didn't guarantee it, but they said, we will work towards getting a Bill of Rights. And this is what got things passed in Massachusetts. This is sort of what got things passed in New York, and it definitely helped getting things passed in Virginia, allowing the United States ultimately to adopt the U.S. Constitution. Now, James Madison, who played a very central role in the Constitutional Convention, who was against a Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention, faced a political problem in Virginia because of the influence of the Anti-Federalists. He had wanted to become elected a senator. He failed at getting elected a senator because of the Anti-Federalist opposition. He barely got elected to Congress, and the only way he could get to Congress is to say, one of the things I will do in that first session is to get a Bill of Rights passed. And so when he got to Congress, and first Congress was really, really busy. They had to create everything. They had to create a State Department. They had to create a Treasury Department. They had to sort of create a whole government out of nothing, almost. And in this process, Madison said, we need to pass a Bill of Rights. And Madison took it upon himself. He took hundreds of recommended amendments, percolated them down to about 100, and then finally submitted 17 amendments which were then taken by Congress and changed into 12 amendments. And these amendments can be looked at in two kinds. One were rights guarantees, and second, and the more dangerous as far as the Federalists were concerned, were changes to the nature of the structure of government. And those 17 became 12, which were passed by the House and the Senate, and 10 were ratified by the states and became what we call the Bill of Rights, which can be separated into the protections of rights, right, which include the first 9 or so, and one complete alteration in the nature of government, which is the 10th Amendment, which says all powers not delegated to Congress are reserved for the states. In short, why do we have a Bill of Rights? We have a Bill of Rights because of a long tradition. We have a Bill of Rights to protect rights. We have a Bill of Rights because of pragmatic politics of the Federalists to get the Constitution accepted. And we have a Bill of Rights because the Anti-Federalists were the losers in history, won this battle. And as a result, I believe, all Americans have been winners. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.